Hello and welcome to Sass Bites. This is your weekly bite of Sass during your lunch break or Hawaii's lunch break or something. We are continuing down the road to SassConf. We're taking the next several weeks to speak with the various speakers, talkers, presenters at SassConf to give you a chance to meet them, hear their story, and to hear about what they're going to be speaking on at SassConf. Speaking of, SassConf is November 11th through 14th down in Austin, Texas. You can buy your tickets now. The tickets are $500 for this 4 days of of talks and workshops, and it's going to be a ton of fun. Workshops are an additional cost if you're interested in doing those as well. So check that out at SassConf.com, I believe is the website.
Something like that, yeah.
I know. If I'm wrong, I'm sure you can Google it. All right. On top of that, there's also coming up September 25th. If you're in the Portland area, I highly recommend coming by Responsive Field Day at responsivefieldday.com. I actually wrote that one down. It's Friday, September 25th from 9 to 6. The schedule just came out, I think today or so, and it's going to be a packed schedule. They've got speakers like Brad Frost, Ethan Marcotte, Jen Simmons, Val Head. It's just pretty much everyone in front-end development is coming down to Portland to spend a day just talking awesome stuff. So if you're in the area, it's only $175. Pick up a ticket, come out, see me. I know there's a bunch of other people here from Portland that'll be out. It's gonna be an exciting time to be in Portland. So you've kind of already heard him in the background. You might see his face dancing around down at the bottom. We've got Jonathan. I totally didn't. Oh, no, there it is. Cutrell. I was like, I didn't even write his last name down here. He's the host of Developer Tea. If you haven't caught that, you definitely should. A top-rated podcast dedicated to exploring development, the developmental craft. And he leads a team of developers at Whiteboard in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And I'm sure they're always hiring. So check out whiteboard.is.
IS. Yeah.
Whiteboard is. So check them out, and it was a cool website. I was like, ooh, pretty good stuff. So welcome to the show, Jonathan. How are you doing?
Thank you, Micah. I'm doing very well. I just came from the office, and it's a little warm in my house right now. But other than that, I'm doing great.
It's good to hear. Appreciate you coming on.
I always forget to change the temperature when I should, and so it kind of defeats
or something, right?
Yeah, you would think it would help. I actually have 2 of them, but I've totally forgotten to actually do anything with them. So
it's usually helpful when you plug them in and set them up and
do stuff with them, right?
Yeah. Well, great. Excited to have you on the show today, especially for the topic of your talk. Something I'm really passionate about and been writing about recently and diving into every day in my current project. But before we get to that, this is a Sass conference. I'm assuming you've at least dabbled in Sass a little bit. Talk to us, how did you get into Sass? What was your first introduction, and how did that change the way that you work?
So I was first introduced to Sass in my very first internship, a front-end development intern. And I had no idea what it was because I barely knew what CSS was, and certainly didn't know how to compile Sass or anything that went along with that. But I saw a friend of mine who I think he's still at Airbnb now, but he was working with Sass, and he was also working with Haml, and he was saying it. This is the future, basically is what I was saying. Now this was back in 2011, I believe, so everything was relatively young and not super stable at the time, I don't think. But I didn't pick it up for quite a while. And then I found Less and started using Less just because it was bootstrap and I was still relatively young and in terms of what I knew about preprocessors. And so I used Less for quite a while, and eventually the features of Sass convinced me that I got pulled over, and SCSS, I guess, is the proper thing to say that I use. I still don't know what the correct differentiator is between the two. I know Sass, there's the Sass engine, and then SCSS is interoperable with strict CSS, I guess you could say.
Yeah, there's two syntaxes. There's the original, actually there was one before it, but there's the original indented syntax, which was very similar to Haml in that it basically took out all the extra cruft. It was all indentations and no semicolons and those kind of things. And then there's the SCSS version, which is basically what most of us know today, which is any valid CSS is valid SCSS. Which is certainly not the case with the indented Sass version. So yeah, it gets a little confusing at times, but yeah, they're the same language. And I believe there's the plan for support of both syntaxes forever and ever because it's not a huge difference. It's just a syntax difference. But the engine underneath is definitely Sass, and beyond that, it's just confusing. So as long as you uppercase the S and lowercase all the rest, you're good to go.
Yeah, that's the important part. Unless you're doing SCSS, and then it's supposed to be all uppercase, right?
SCSS is again just a syntax. Yeah, so you're always doing Sass.
Right. Okay. That's okay.
All right.
All right. So it's just the syntax.
Exactly. Just the syntax. Yep. So great. So a long road, but we're glad you got to Sass and seem to be taking advantage of it quite well now. So outside of Whiteboard, what else are you involved in? What else do you do down in Chattanooga?
Two big things, really. One, I'm married, so I love spending time with my wife, and she actually works at Whiteboard with me, but we still enjoy hanging out after work too. So that makes for a positive relationship. I have a dog as well, but that's not the second thing. The second thing is,
I heard he's unemployed though, so probably still looking for.
Yeah. So the dog doesn't come to the office yet. Still spends most of her days in the crate, but what can you do? No, the other thing is developer team. So I spend a lot of my time outside of work cultivating the audience and trying to create really compelling content for developers of all walks, whether you're beginner or you're well into your career. It's in some ways it's similar to Sass Bites, particularly the format being short, right? Or shorter than the average podcast. So yeah, that's what I do, I guess, outside of work.
Now, is the format, do you do interviews as well, or is it kind of a mix, or is it mostly diving into code?
Yeah, I do interviews. In fact, I interviewed Hampton Catlin one time. Let's see, I've interviewed, Chris Coyer, a couple of other people in that vein, like the CSS or SCSS or Sass rather. I'll get it, I promise. But then I've also gone, completely the other direction towards entrepreneurs. And I even spoke with Ben Lesh, who does JavaScript at Netflix. So just a very wide array of people. Yeah.
Very cool. Yeah, it's probably the best part about it is just all the people that you get to meet, like all those random connections that, it might be weird to invite a random person for a drink you've never met, but hey, you want to come on a podcast? We're all for it.
Yeah, exactly. No, like cold call emails are so much easier to send now because I have something to, put out in front of me and be like, hey, it's because of this, not because I just like you,
Which is really the reason you invite those people onto the shows.
It's all a facade.
Well, awesome. So at SassConf this year, you're going to be talking about attribute-driven styles called the good, the bad, and the unknown. What's your elevator pitch for this? Why should people come and catch your talk?
Well, good code. So often we have this misconception that good code has something to do with the computer, and in reality, especially for a language like Sass or CSS, good code has way more to do with the human than it does with the computer. And so a lot of what we do, we still are doing in CSS because the computer likes it that way more than the human likes it that way. Specifically, I'm referring to using class syntax for most of our styling. So a lot of what we've had to do to combat some of the problems is create these systems that are basically driven off of convention. And remembering these things and having a guide that sits alongside your CSS. And you have to refer to that guide over and over to see how you're supposed to name things. And so attribute module driven CSS or attribute driven CSS, it allows you to be more specific about what you are writing. And instead of giving you a dot, right, which is what a class is, it gives you a much more flexible syntax to be more descriptive in your naming structures. And that in and of itself is a powerful enough reason to consider it, right? There are many other reasons why you may consider attribute module driven CSS. One of my favorites, and Micah, you actually mentioned this just before we started recording, but that is the presence of an attribute, right? So just the fact that the attribute is on the element, you can select based on that alone. And this is true for the attribute class, right? So if an element has classes, but you can create all of these different attributes that are much more specific and much more semantically rich, I guess you could say.
So the approach that you're taking, is it 100% attribute driven, or is it a combination of attributes and classes, or what is your markup going to look like?
So here is the I guess you could call this a confession. I haven't moved myself over to this yet. And mostly because this is a theoretical conversation for most people, right? And Micah, you've probably done more of this than I have. My pitch is that classes have a collision. The word class collides with our programming mind's understanding of what a class actually is, right? So
it's absolutely nothing to do with extending a class or object-oriented classes or anything like that whatsoever.
Exactly. Yep. And so I want to, create space for us to use classes in the way that we already think of them. But the implementation details there have always been fuzzy and overly flexible, right? It's difficult to know what to name something, right? And we always come up against this. If you are writing CS, or if you're writing HTML, probably 90% of what you're doing is trying to figure out what to name stuff. Describing content is relatively easy if you know what the tags are, but knowing what classes to use and knowing what the long-term effects of those classes are, should I use utility classes? What are the semantic issues with using utility classes? Or should I use BIM or should I use OO? Well, all of these are just the same thing in HTML, right? None of this actually has an effect on the actual implementation details because it's all classes. Maybe your
computer doesn't care.
Right, exactly. The computer reads it either way, right? The biggest difference being how many characters you're using. And that's really the only difference, how much is going down the pipe. So I think it's worth exploring why we think that is the way to go, right? And I've heard it said that classes are in many ways similar to, they're more like variables, right? We use them more like variables because they're given a name. And they're also global variables in many ways. So
pretty much, yeah, thousands of global variables all throughout your site.
And so now you're basically creating systems to try to rein in what is ultimately a bunch of global variables. And so, then you get into specificity issues, and especially if you're using something that generates classes for you. So for example, let's say you're building a WordPress site, and in your HTML tag or your body classes, WordPress generates body classes. Well, if you aren't actually looking at what those body classes are, you could very easily create some very wrong things accidentally, right?
So apply it to your entire page.
Yeah, exactly. Like font sizing, for example. You could totally override the font size on a specific page and not have any idea why it's happening until you investigate and go and look and see, okay, where is this actually coming from, right? So the idea of attribute modules is to be much more specific and intentional about how you are applying that CSS rather than trying to globalize everything, right? So the concept of cascading is good only if it's controlled. Only if you weren't accidentally cascading all over the place, right?
Yeah, I wrote just a big complaint piece this last year about how we're abusing the cascade in such a horrible way. We're setting ourselves up to fail by taking these really global variables and then doing slightly more less global and more more specific, more specific, more specific until you've got this combination of styles coming from 5 different things at 5 different specificity levels, and the chance of changing something without breaking something is pretty much impossible at that point. So yeah, anything we can do to rein that in and do it in a way that makes sense for us. I know one of the big things I strive for with my styles, especially with attributes, is to make everything opt-in. So there's never styles that just show up places. It's here's options and opportunities for you to opt into some variation or some kind of context. So instead of having just some global float left or some global left variable, we have alignment attributes, but they only do something if that component's actually opted into it. So yeah, for us, being able to separate out classes just names the thing, what the thing is. And then we have attributes that are able to basically specify all those different variations and opt into all those different, all the different things that component can do and the ways that it can display. So yeah, attributes for us are really, really essential for the work that we do. So I'm sure you probably have a lot of other good examples that you've been thinking of as well. Yeah.
So simple examples like taking advantage of some of these conceptual ideas that have come out for design, like Brad Frost's atomic design. You can actually create, data dash atom, or if you don't respect the data dash, like if you don't care about that, a lot of people don't.
I think it's still just IE8 that requires that.
I don't know. I don't think that it necessarily requires it as much as it is invalid, right? It considers it invalid. It will still parse it. It just looks at you kind of weird, like. So I mean, it should still work fine. It's just
So you could just say atom equals
exactly.
Name is.
Yeah, and then organism or whatever those names are that you're using. And so instead of saying class atom dash, right, which is okay, you can do what you're saying. You can have it checks for the existence of atom, and then inside of that, like let's say you're writing Sass, you can indent inside of atom and do all of your atoms there, right? You can control it that way. Depending on how you do your file structure, you may not want everything. And maybe you want to do things by organism and do your files as organisms, whatever. If you're not familiar, by the way, with atomic design, I recommend going and reading over Brad Frost's basic explanation of it. But it doesn't just apply to atomic design. Everybody has different things that work well for their team and work well for whatever product they're building, right? So, maybe you want to do something more like object-oriented, and maybe you want to have, variations on different types of objects. Well, you can make your base object the attribute itself, and then you can put in the attribute's value the extension of that object. Or what variation. Maybe you have base as the extent or as the name, and then you can change the name to something other than base if you want to extend it and do variations on that object.
Yeah. And then on top of that is you can have multiple values inside of that attribute, and you can test for the inclusion of them, or if there's only that single one. And so yeah, CSS is pretty powerful in the way that it can treat the values inside of that.
Yeah, another thing I like about attributes is that you can actually start them with numbers, for example. So you could have, and you can also do slashes in attributes, right? Classes don't allow that kind of stuff. So you can't do like .1, right? But with an attribute, you could say call, like COL equals, and then do a whole string of breakpointed columns. And then you go through the process
rather than this nasty column 6 SM, column 8, blah 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 blah, and down the road. Yep.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, there are many examples where attributes make sense, and there are still examples where classes make sense, right? So I don't think that we have to throw the whole system out. I think there are definitely useful pieces. I think the most there's 2 really big arguments against attributes right now. And the first one is really kind of moot anyway, and that's JavaScript performance, right? And that's mostly only necessary if you have a ton of elements on the page and you're having to reselect them over and over, right? If you can cache your selections, then that doesn't matter so much. Now, at this point, we're just talking about semantics, right?
And we're also just talking about like small. I click a button and something pops up.
Exactly.
We're not talking about entire JavaScript systems based on these class names, which are really more ornamental, more about the design than it is some functional app. So,
yeah, and it's not about painting either, right? Like you're not, and that those performance issues are usually around rendering and painting more than they are around actual execution time or DOM querying time. Unless, again, like I said, unless you're doing a major number of queries. If you have a super long list of things or whatever, but that still doesn't, you could still add classes to those elements, right? So you can still have your JS hook classes, for example. I saw that pattern is one of my favorite patterns. But query selector all is still really fast, right? Like it's not going to be like you're stuck, you're not parsing the whole document. You're still getting the selection engine that you get in CSS in JavaScript. And it's totally fine for almost all cases, right?
And what's the other thing that is typically the downfall or negative?
Community. And I guess the number of people who would be able to easily pick up your code and know exactly what's going on. Now, I would argue that you can't do that now anyway, right? You still have to read through documents and read through commits and try to figure out what the system is. But I think right now, if we were to try to, like, let's say, switch a huge project like Bootstrap or something over to attribute modules, there would be an uproar because there's a little bit more subjectivity maybe in how to handle attribute modules, and what things should be named certain things. And the same is true for classes, but I think the community would reject it a little bit faster, which is why we need to start having the conversations and question the assumptions that we have about why we are choosing to stick with this relatively flat set of tools.
Yeah, because we moved from like IDs being pretty commonplace. I mean, people would say, well, if there's only one on the page, use an ID. That's the best way to do it. Yeah. And then we eventually moved over like, oh, never mind, forget that. Classes for everything. Don't even think about IDs.
Right.
So there is an opportunity to transition. Like it can happen, and it's happened before. Moving either completely to an attribute-based model or some kind of hybrid model will take time as well for people to start playing with it, accepting it, and writing about it, and talking about it. So, obviously, this is one of those first steps: is getting out there and getting people excited about the idea.
Yeah, absolutely. I think trying to build something small with it is also a really good step, right? I challenge anybody who's listening to this right now or watching rather. To go and try to build something in CodePen or whatever tool you use to do little demos, and use attributes only. Now, if you're not familiar with attribute modules or attributes, basically it's the same thing as saying class equals whatever, right? Except don't use the word class. Use your own word. And then go look at some documentation on how to select stuff in CSS using attributes rather than classes. And I think you will be surprised at the flexibility and also the readability of your code in the end. Now, for those of you who are more experienced with Sass, try to create a few mixins that allow for the flexibility in attributes. I created a system the other day that did the atomic design, just a couple of really simple mixins. And it was really incredible to read the CSS because it read much more articulately at the end of that process than my CSS has with just classes. Much more articulate.
That's very cool. Yeah, the idea of creating mixins that basically build those selectors for you, so you're not constantly needing to write them. Because instead of a dot something, it's brackets and equal signs and quote marks and all those kind of things, which, it's more clicks, it's more typing.
Yeah.
But if you can abstract that away into a mixin, that makes it even simpler to be able to use that, and also maybe restricts the number of attributes that you have to work with, and build that into that system. So I can see those are two really good ideas to get out there and start playing with it, start doing it. So this sounds like a good talk. I'm looking forward to hearing it.
I'm looking forward to it too. It's actually, so the cool thing about, I'm not sure if they've announced this yet, but this is going to be a panel, like a discussion.
Oh, okay.
So the community will be able to talk back. And I'm not sure exactly what that's going to look like just yet. So stay tuned on that one. And if you don't have your ticket yet, obviously you're going to want to go and get a ticket. But and come out, and if you are there, you'll be able to talk a little bit better than if you're not there, of course. You know, watching this is not going to be as fun as being there. I know that, yeah, some people just stick around and wait for the YouTube videos. This one's going to be, you know, you can actually shape the discussion, which will be really interesting. So I'm looking forward to hearing the strong arguments against it. I've presented some of these ideas to my coworkers, and they're mixed reactions, right? So I'm sure that there will be as mixed reactions at SassConf as well.
Awesome. Well, Jonathan, thank you for coming on the show today. Appreciate your flexibility and getting the time to work out. And yeah, that sounds like a great talk. So keep at it. I hope you find an opportunity to implement this on a large project. I'd love to kind of hear your feedback, because we've gotten, you know, several thousand lines of code now into our project using kind of a hybrid approach. It's been really a lot of fun and a success so far. So I'd love to hear your experience if you get a chance to play with that even more.
Yeah,
so,
that's my plan.
Awesome. Well, for everyone watching, thanks for catching another show of Sass Bites on our road to SassConf. We're going to be back again, probably I think the regular time next week, 12 o'clock Pacific on Thursday, with a couple more guests lined up to talk more about what's going to be coming up in November. So again, November 11th through 14th, SassConf.com, $500 for your ticket. Go pick it up now. Check it out. It's going to be a great, great time down in Austin. So thanks everyone for stopping by today, and we'll see you again next week. Later.
Bye.